that's what the biggest revelation, I think, when we had that reading, because I think that definitely one of the messages which I find so much resonance in within my personal life, but also within my creativity, is this idea, this duality of the mask. Because we tend to think of a mask as like this thing that you hide behind, and certainly there's a lot of truth to that. But there's also a lot of transformation that takes place within wearing a mask. Sometimes the face itself is a mask. It's a layer of skin put over your skeleton to kind of define a face. And so when you go into that sort of idea, it's like this sort of what you sort of create and what you sort of exist as through your identity is essentially a mask. It's a creation. It's a form you've created to make yourself into an identity. And so with every age, with every emotion, there's 1,000 identities, and you are kind of the decider, the selector within each and every one of those.
Are you though? Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Blue Hour podcast, where we explore the minds and the worlds of visionary artists and creators. This week's episode features Charlie Jimenez, and we sat down together last summer in London to discuss all sorts of things you won't want to miss. Charlie is known for weaving mythology and the body together in moving images and performances that evoke surreal and intimate dialogues about the nature of identity, gender, and the process of transformation. Through their art, Charlie invites us into contemplative, dreamlike spaces where the lines between reality and myth begin to blur, pushing us to confront who we really are beneath the layers. So welcome to this podcast. Thanks for accepting to join me in this little pleasure. Backyard.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I think already this has been such a... I feel so like there's been such a revelation already just with your reading.
The reading, yeah. Yeah, we just did an astrology reading like I do for every intro. Maybe we can start with that. What was the thing that came out like as a revelation?
I've been making a lot of artworks and films which specifically relate to alchemy of the body and the idea of transformation through the primal place of pain, suffering, and taking from those experiences lessons and challenges which ultimately force the body to adapt and to kind of respond by changing. And so I just finished shooting this surrealist film about a woman who's born out of a lion corpse, and she kind of reassembles her life as she finds herself transformed into several creatures, eventually becoming a chimera, like a multiple-headed character. And the film is sort of about like when you are essentially confronted in a place where you are experiencing loss and are defeated, and essentially through that kind of passage, through that kind of place, through being forced into another place, you are then forced to confront a new life. And that I find is a very resonant subject for me, especially now. I've experienced so many new revelations in my life in such a short time. Today is actually the day of which my friend Dextra is having a vigil done for them for their passing. I've just graduated also from Central St. Martin's, so everything's feeling very much like water's running, very liminal, very much like a new phase is about to be entered. And I feel like I've evolved, I've changed so much from how I first started out, and it's exciting, but also I feel that everything that I've been making, everything that I've been creating is a reflection of this constant process, which is just going to keep going. And I'm excited to see where it goes, but also I await new challenges and new confrontations, which I think are going to be really exciting and scary as well.
Yeah, and for those who don't know your work, I know I saw one of your performance a few nights ago. It was like you work a lot with mask. It was very theatrical and movement and emotion based.
Yeah, actually, the mask I used is also this one.
Okay, you brought it with you.
It was sort of like it was done at Theatre Delhi, and it was basically organized by this guy called Alex who runs the Post-Human Theatre, and I used to do workshops with him. He does Butoh, and the performance that I did was with saxophonist Simon Grancher, and we both do a lot of collaborations together. We recently did a performance at the Hornica Center for Tim Yep, and essentially our performance was centered around death and rebirth, specifically the process in which as a body you age and become someone else. And it's a process of kind of shedding your skin. In the case of the performance, we had multiple masks that were overlaid over to my body. And the idea is that the character that I'm portraying within that performance is essentially multiple ages. So this mask was actually like a cast of my face when I was 14 years old. And this mask was meant to represent essentially the dead self, which is a kind of like masked over, fleshed over eye, completely empty, with a other side of the face which is meant to represent the present. And so this performance was meant to be sort of like a performance about the duality of age, and I think that's one of the themes that I'm thinking a lot about. And
you know what, when you're talking about that, something that struck me in that performance that I saw, well, I tagged you in the picture at the end where you have like you have this mask that's coming out of your chest, and you remove it, and then there's the heart underneath, and then you do kind of this this sign, which is the, I don't know, from the Golden Dawn, I know it represents like fire and the willpower.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So it's like your what I saw when I saw this symbolism in your work, I was like, okay, so the mask is all the personas you play, and they're infinite. You can play any character you want in your life. Jim Carrey, his movie, when he reenacts this character and can't get out of the role even after the scenes, depicts this well. But the real self is the solar self that we just mentioned in your Vedic astrology. And for me, it was like, okay, now I found my true self under the masks that were they were over your heart. They were not just over your face, that you had masks that were covering your heart, and you're removing the masks that cover your soul. And we saw that relationship in your astrology. And then you take this and you make it, you almost make it like I don't know, you sanctify it and you put it in the, the ajna center, which projects the higher will from this heart. That's all the symbolism I saw. So from those masks to finding your true Aquarian self through the other, which is the masks.
That's what the biggest revelation, I think, when we had that reading, because I think that definitely one of the messages which I find so much resonance within my personal life, but also within my creativity, is this idea, this duality of the mask. Because we tend to think of a mask as like this thing that you hide behind, and certainly there's a lot of truth to that. But there's also a lot of transformation that takes place within wearing a mask. Sometimes the face itself is a mask. It's a layer of skin put over your skeleton to kind of define a face. And so when you go into that sort of idea, it's very much, Butterfly gave you a little kiss on the forehead. That's really lovely.
Yeah, that was nice.
It's like this sort of what you sort of create and what you sort of exist as through your identity is essentially a mask. It's a creation. It's a form you've created to make yourself into an identity. And so with every age, with every emotion, there's 1,000 identities, and you are kind of the decider, the selector within each and every one of those.
Are you though?
That's the thing. It's all a mirage, I think. And I kind of think
I'm more of targeting like who actually chooses. Who is this entity that picks those masks and those?
You live through them like vicariously. You don't pick. I think there's always like cycles or repetitions, but I think for myself, there's no definitive one. I think kind of the point is that they all sort of keep growing and they keep changing, and you, as a result of changing, become different people.
But I think like for you in your chart, the scorpionic energy, and you have a lot of energy in the 8th house as well. It is in your nature to have this perspective of growth and changing masks. But what I see in the world is a lot of people are scared of outgrowing their mask, and they hide behind it until they can't, anymore, and some tragedy happens to remove the mask. So it's not, I don't think society encourages transformation and growth. Like if you see how the system is built, very like there's a structure that's in place and you have to follow the rules. It's meant to like not transform, to keep yourself stable so that you're easy to understand and control in some way.
It's a very interesting duality, because I think with what oppression there also is a lot of sort of confrontation of that. And there's also on the charts we were reading about this specific reading of like this presence of self is specifically informed by what others give to you. And I think it's an interesting duality again, because I think once you are essentially given a mask by society, you're also stripping that away by sort of a frustration of being conformed to a body, of being conformed to a self. And so you create your own mask from that, and you take those elements. It's a constant conflict, and I think that the conflict of it is kind of what allows that conversation to take place. And it's what makes it interesting, because things can be both artificial and truthful. And I think that is one emotion that I find really fascinating to explore in a lot of my work. A lot of my work is populated with masks, and it's populated with very surrealist kind of realities and settings, often taking place in dreamscapes or very kind of obscurely outlined versions of places, memories, and often kind of blurring the lines between what period it takes place in. And often that kind of thing is kept completely mysterious, so that when someone looks at it, they kind of view it more as almost like a palette of one place, like almost as if the mask of the body is also the mask of the place and the mask of the space as well. And I think that this sort of area, this liminal area of like constant transformation between time and shape, I think is sort of like what attracts me, I think.
Yeah, I do appreciate that about your work, and in general about artists that work with this timelessness. Do you know the filmmaker Tarkovsky?
Yes! Sculpting in time, bro! No, Andrei Tarkovsky and Bela Tarr. I watched Werkmeister. They did a restoration of Werkmeister Harmonies, and I saw that, and it was like, there was this thing that I heard about like the pseudo-reality, or the idea that it's sort of like, you gotta make something feel like it's realistic, but at the same time, it's not real life. It's like, it is a reflection or a construction of what real life is, but it's also kind of like, it needs illusion. And film is illusion. It is always by design illusion, 24 frames per second. It is kind of like all about perception, I think. And what I really love, I think I'm also really inspired by filmmakers. Some of my favorite filmmakers is French-Chilean surrealist filmmaker Rebirth, who made City of Pirates, which the film, there's no city and there's no pirates in the film. But it's like filmmakers that deal a lot with just sort of like sculpting in time and like identities in almost like these movies are sort of like memory stories or like diary entries that have been turned into like visual poems.
Yeah, like my favorite movie from Tarkovsky is like there's a few characters, but they play different roles. So like one time it's the same like human is the uncle of someone, and then he comes back as the father of that same person.
Is this Nostalgia?
I think that's the one.
Yeah.
And so like the events don't make sense. And so as soon as you start understanding, okay, I can't grip to like a timeline, then something magical happens in the movie. Like then you start paying attention more to like the textures, and like it becomes more like a moving poem for me than it is like a story. And so you get something that's more subjective from the movie, instead of having like, okay, a value that is that this character embodies and goes through these struggles, and then there's a resolution. It's
definitely. I think that's the form I really love the most, like the kind of moving image narrative. It's the story in itself is a sequence, but the sequence is a process. I mean, like life is, it's a discovery, and you may not understand everything, and that's fine. You know, you are the first thing that comes in an image, more than intellect, is intuition and the sense of things flowing. And I think that I'm a really big fan of like experimental filmmakers like Patrick Bokanowski and recently Scott Barley, and what they do is celebrate that sometimes we best understand ourselves through firstly seeing and firstly feeling, and through just seeing how like an arm can start from one point and then transition into another, and then the next frame it's someone else's hand. It's like you're seeing a transformation in sequence. And it's interesting because I thought about like just the definition of what a story is, and when I thought of it as a series of sequences that make up something, doesn't necessarily have to be defined. You are there for the process, and I kind of like to treat my work like that as well. I think that it's sort of like people are also very captivated by mysteries. They're captivated by things that engage them on a journey into something very secret and very intimate, the place of dreams or identity, or yourself changing, or like, you know, something's changed, you've lost your house, or you've, you know, a relative has died, or, you know, it's put you into the spectrum, and you've got to kind of go down it. You've got to kind of be the one to kind of go down this route. And there's joy in, Scott Barley kind of described it as sort of a process of like when you're walking in the woods and you let go of the hand of your father or whatever, your parent, and you just let yourself go into the woods by yourself, and you just get lost in it. I love that form of telling stories. I think it's a way of allowing the audience it's a way of allowing them sort of the ability to let their own minds flow through the work.
And it's funny what you just said. When I studied photography in art school, and I come not from a background of artists in my family. My dad is very artistic, but he never did art for art's sake, you know. So when I arrived to art school, I was just a young teen that didn't know himself. And then I had to create a body of work, conceptualize, like I didn't know any of these terms.
Even the idea, body of work.
Yeah. So I had a camera, I knew how it worked. They taught me that large format. And my first reflex was to go in the forest, in the middle of the forest. Like I would just enter by a street and just walk in the random forest with a camera and my backpack and like battery lights. And then I would start taking branches and stuff and create stuff in the middle of the forest. And it was the forest where I grew up. So my family home, there was a big forest behind. So, and I had all these memories of these little waterways, this big tree that had fallen down there. And we had created all these narratives. It reminds me a bit like Winnie the Pooh in his backyard, all those things that happened. That's how I felt when I was a kid. And as soon as I got the challenge of creating a body of work, my reflex was, okay, I'm going to go back there, but with those new eyes. And it was a bit of a way to kind of resolve my childhood by going there and letting go of my parents' hands. And like,
it's interesting memory because, and I agree with this. I think that in remembering anything, it's a process of reconstruction. It's a process of finding that thing that you've kept onto, but you're never going to be able to authentically go back to it. You're in returning to it, you're creating something new. You're actually physically going back there, but it's a place that's changed with time. It's a place that's gone and changed. And so it's interesting how sometimes even, you know, some people might find themselves very lost, like, oh, I want to create something original, or, you know, I don't know what to create next. You know, sometimes there's value in going back to even where you began, or even just places where you don't know, but it is somewhere that you lived in, and sometimes kind of creating something new within that. And I think a lot of my first starting out was actually, oh, sorry about that. I did that. A lot of kind of my start was, so for the first half of my life, I was living in the southwest of England in Dorchester, and also just this thing about the forest. Like, I used to do a lot of kind of rituals in the woods, and I used to kind of go out, and a part of what I would do from 2019 to 2018, I would often do photo shoots mixed with sort of these rituals, and it was a process. It's good. Don't mind it. But it would essentially be like a process of sort of like, because obviously when you have these memories of going to the woods when you're a child, and I feel like the woods always is a place where I feel like you're always being confronted with this sense of, I don't know, like the sense that it's sort of like a place that can't be touched almost. Like every time I go into the woods, I feel completely refreshed. I feel like, just the towering presence of trees, just all the greenery surrounding you.
But for me, it's also like I think that we equate a lot forest with like our childhood, because for me, it's like a place. It is like a childhood is a forest, it's like, or the archetype of it, a place to where everything is possible. An animal can pass by, a branch can fall down. Like, it's kind of this limitless infinity of like potential and of life, of creativity, pure creativity that's sparking into trees, into this, into that. So there's kind of this fantasy world that you can create as soon as you enter it.
But even like the marking of childhood, I find also a very interesting kind of like, dissection, because it's sort of like to even consider oneself like a childhood. Like, I personally feel like my life just flowed into one, and it's still going. I kind of feel like there wasn't a chapter where I could feel like, okay, my life ended there and it started again. And I think it's interesting because it speaks also into this idea of like self-identity or self-fictionalization, where you are creating your life, or you're kind of marking out your chapter. And
but what about in January 2023?
Yeah.
Because that would have marked, like, I do see with the doshas in astrology, it's like big chapters that, and I learned that recently, like, you become the planet that you're in the cycle of. So if you grew up, I don't remember what was before the moon in your chart, but in 2021, you became like the moon. You become more reflective. You become more introspective, more connected with your emotions, or forced to.
I think a lot of things changed, and I think you'd be right that maybe that change is enough to persuade one to think that a new life has begun. And I think that for me, the kind of metaphor that I've been constantly going back to is just the world feeling like running water. So much in the world just generally right now feels chaotic. Things being resolved, things ending, things starting, riots breaking out, wars happening, wars ending, wars starting. It's this constant flux which seems to envelop us all in this like very kind of primal state of like either like getting out and beginning, or like completely ending. And it's scary, but it's also something that sometimes takes such a long time before it can really be understood. And I think there's a firstness to it, which I think I personally really sort of find myself attracted to, because it's kind of like you don't necessarily know how it's going to go. And I think that, again, that looseness kind of, in not having that resolution, you're kind of then forced to, to find a resolution. And I think that, again, like the sort of constant flux of things keeps you also growing. And I would say for myself, I feel like maybe I've changed and I just haven't noticed it. I feel like if maybe I'm bound for some reflection, maybe that's it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the moon, like you're saying, like the flow, it feels like it's flowing. I think that's the ideal. And the moon does regulate water, like it is connected with water. And I think in an ideal world, that's what you do, right? You're like the moon, you reflect as as the sun beams on you, like as consciousness, as you're conscious of things, it goes back and gets processed on the spot and continues, and there's never
you oscillate and you feed into the same source.
Yeah, you're just completely present with this loop of conscious unconscious, and you process things. But yeah, this demands like a inner work, that because when you're in your childhood, you are naturally like that. Like children, they feel something, they'll express it with emotions very strongly, and then you become into this box life that like some stuff is not acceptable anymore. So you have to kind of cut down the flow a little bit so that you can like go to your home, and then you can open again and like let the flow go. And then
I feel that a lot. Like I think that for me, I almost feel that I have been reliving my childhood, or if anything, creating a new one. Since COVID, I think just my sense of time completely obscured with it once everyone was asked to just retreat back into their homes. And I found that throughout that period, one of the things that I kind of felt was constantly growing within me was the sense of like almost your house was becoming your body. And I found that within that period, I was kind of returning to a lot of my memories, I was living with my parents during the pandemic, and I would often feel that I was like having to kind of return to old memories and make them again. And I lost my train of thought. I was talking about one of the things that I kind of feel is interesting, just in what I've observed in people who are in their 80s, in their 40s, is there's almost this sort of ageless identity, or there's almost ageless childhood, as I like to kind of coin it. And this is kind of an idea I've been kind of obsessed with a lot of my photography, often depicting kind of characters who are sort of androgynous, or often kind of share kind of like girl or boy traits and are very sort of mixed. And it's kind of like this idea of sort of like a period, or this term called anemoia, the kind of the feeling of remembering a past that you never experienced. It's sort of like this constant flux of, in feeling that you've remembered something, you're also creating something. And I think that's something I also really connect to, also just sort of like this sense of you're kind of creating your own sort of future and your own past. And it's almost like your own mythology in that sort of way.
Yeah, it's interesting how you perceive these things, like it is a very unique perspective of how you just put it. But I think there is like a truth that I'm trying to kind of, absorb and digest at the same time. But like, I feel the resonance of what you just said, like almost like you're creating your past, and like the timeline kind of shifts through the mind, because the mind, we create this illusion of time only because of the progress of events in our lifetime, but our mind doesn't have a sun that rotates inside. So
yeah, I think it's like, again, it's like going back to that kind of idea of sort of like the conflict, or sometimes the paradox between things that are both illusions but also truth. And through sometimes creating an illusion, sometimes there can be truth that's found. And actually, one of the things that my friend Dextra, who recently passed away, said to me, this thought that really kind of stimulated me was this they said that sometimes a cartoon can feel more realistic than real life. And I thought about that for a lot, because it just made me think about how sometimes what someone reads as subjectively pure to them can enter their feelings more truthfully than other things. And that, I think, just sort of made me really think about just how we also perceive and connect things to associations, and how those things can sometimes unlock emotions, or unlock kind of like inner transformations through introspective worlds. And
yeah, and I guess that depends also on your level of sensitivity. Like if you're materialistic, like it will be more tangible things that will have this effect. But if you're like hypersensitive, you can see a color of a carpet, and then all of a sudden this kind of urge of emotion just possesses you, and this kind of there's a term for that, like when you see colors and all the senses kind of start mixing.
Synesthesia.
Yeah, this kind of I feel like that's what you're describing a little bit. This, where the five senses are are not limited to what we told them to do anymore.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think also when you're working with photography and film, you're having to often like comprise a lot of those emotions and senses to like flatness, because it's also like an image and a sound. But it's interesting because it's sort of like I also I started out as an animator. Like I used to do stop motion, and then I was kicked out of my uni and I chose to do performance more.
Why were you kicked out?
Yeah. No, they didn't. They just thought I was too weird.
Too weird. They were like, "Go fit in, get
But
out."
I got like while I was there, I was also, you know, when you're animating, you're thinking a lot about the body and you're thinking a lot about the transformations that take place within each frame. And so I was constantly looking to my body, and I started finding that I often wanted to, you know, there was one stop motion I made where I was animating myself over the course of 6 hours in this bedroom that I filled the floor with grass. My mother was not so happy about the smell. And I was like basically playing multiple characters. I had like a little wireless remote in my hand, and I was finding as I was animating myself, I gradually started to feel that I really resonated a lot with dance, because in dance you're kind of sculpting your body in constant motion, and I love that actually in performing you're kind of causing yourself to transform by moving, by sculpting. And when I realized how tangible the abstract was within movement, I felt really seen. And I then started creating. I studied at Central St. Martin's and moved to London during the beginning of lockdown, and I started creating performances with many of my friends. And so one of the most inspiring forms of performance is Butoh, which one of my favorite sort of performers is Katsuo Ono. And what I find really fascinating about what Katsuo Ono did is that a lot of their output was kind of expressed through these very sort of almost hypnotic movements that would be defined by just the way that they articulated their body, and sometimes just their presence in a space. And it's interesting because a lot of people really struggle to define what Butoh is, but it sort of transforms. And I think the conclusion that a lot of people bring is that what each person brings to Butoh is sort of their own personal conflicts of their body, their own personal sort of transformations, and that seems to become kind of a basis for most people's sort of interactivity. And so but there are a lot of these sort of the way that I see Butoh is that it's almost sort of like a sculptural form of performance, where you're kind of imagining your body as a sort of a mnemonic, and you're imagining that your sort of like movements are images. And it feels to me like a synthesis between dance and acting, where your body is confronted with this space that is inherently abstract, and you are, as a body, reshaping yourself through thinking of your body in a non-linear way. A lot of the sort of exercises are often like these mnemonic games where they ask us to imagine that they're kind of like ants, you know, curling into the mouth, or there's a fish bowl on the pelvis and it's swishing water, and it gets your body to move in these very sort of like very organic ways. And I found that what I really took away from Butoh was the fact that it got me to really realize that my body, and also just in all of my art, one of the things I'm constantly looking for is just this sense of transforming the margins of what it means to be in a body. You know, and in the case of Butoh, it's this sort of sense of like, when you think of yourself as a shape, you know, you are in a way kind of re-identifying yourself. And you're given that freedom, that space within performance. And particularly within like no theatre and kabuki, there'd be a lot of transitioning between performers, often in terms of gender as well. And, you know, and sometimes often they would not like to be referred to by their sort of likeness, their original likeness, and sometimes only by their character. And it's kind of, and I think just as we've evolved, obviously, now, especially more than ever, identity is so much more fluid and so much more openly accepted. And I think that just as I exist in my own body, I have so many questions which I don't have the answer for, or don't even understand how I even want to live in my body. And I can see, even just in the future, maybe I might not even be, who I identify as now. Just like I might just completely change or transition. I think that just through performance, there's really been this sort of sense of realigning just what I have taken for granted in just my past life, and what now having more awareness of has allowed me to really think about in terms of the
Have
body.
you heard of chaos magic?
Sounds familiar.
Because it feels like you're describing a form of chaos magic. And chaos magic could be defined as like the art of transformation, but through like random, like you basically make your own rituals.
Oh, like stimuli, psychomagic.
Yeah, like it could be a form of that. And like magic basically is the science of the mind, and it feels like what you're describing, these techniques, is a way to scientifically start understanding who you are and what you want to be. It's a form of a transformation through understanding how the mind works. Like if there are a lot of meditation with shapes, I remember at a mystery school in Toronto, they taught us like a technique to access your inner temple. And it was like an old Platonic meditation, and you would start in a cube. So you would visualize yourself in a cube, imagine the taste in your mouth, the feeling, the resonance, and then this cube would open up into a pyramid, and then you would go into a pyramid, and then how does that taste, how does that feel, how does that sound, all the senses, and then this opens up into a sphere, and then finally like there's like a light pouring down the sphere, and this opens up, and now you're in your inner space.
God, that level of transcendence really reminds me of like Marcel Marceau's The Cage, where it's like they start out in a box and they want to sort of leave the box, and so they grow the shape of the box until they're eventually in a planet, and then when they reach outside of the planet, there are multiple versions of it, either they die or they enter just their body, that they just enter themselves. And that I find is such a beautiful metaphor.
It's like just different forms of meditation that can be so powerful. Like I think what is defined as like magic, like actual like ceremonial magic and stuff like that, like through like conversations like this, but I feel like in the future it will transform as we understand who we are, which is closer to who our mind is, what our mind is, than like our physicality, our emotions, and all those things we define ourselves with. We're gonna find new ways of transforming ourselves through all the things you've mentioned. Feel like they're very directly like the old system is ceremonial magic and these types of practices, and then the new is more through the individuality. You create your own ceremonies through art.
Definitely.
And
I think
redefine,
post-humanism especially, Donna Haraway generally I find really inspiring, but I think just the world, I think, is also kind of really embracing post-humanism, and it's going to continue to grow, and I'm really excited for just like how people are transforming their bodies also to kind of manifest their own autonomy and to really manifest just sort of like who they deeply believe they are, and also just kind of confronting the sort of relations between the body and also just between changes as well, and kind of letting that speak more openly. I think that, magic I find generally, to me, means transcending and being able to sort of confront multiple levels of just change, and being able to let that happen, spontaneously, but also progressively. And I think that just within my, that's also just like one of the reasons why I also like to make films, is because I think when I make films, I'm often involving almost every sort of capability of myself, to the point that I'm having to face so much more challenges, to the point that I have to change to create a film.
And that's what's so exciting, like your presence, like having your son in Aquarius. I see it as like this kind of a curiosity to push boundaries and understand things on the next level, push the intellectual capacities. And with all that transformative energy that you're mentioning and that I saw in your chart, I feel like I could meet you for another podcast like in a year, and you'll have like understood something
yeah,
that someone in a
completely
whole
different person.
lifetime will not have yet like understood, just because you're pushing your limits to your body through all the senses.
Definitely. So this is also just a very like a very special time also maybe to interview, just because I feel like I'm at a period where I feel like I'm leaving just whatever I've done before, and I don't know how things are going to be. Like, I think also maybe I also said that like 3 years ago when I had my last interview, but it really, I find that I'm embracing kind of a lot more of the fact that sometimes, and I think this is also generally, I would say to anyone who is also really struggling to find what they identify as, sometimes it's important to just begin, to just sort of like begin by doing, to sometimes being able to process and being able to just be out there, be active. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the actual process of physically being involved in something, movement, is a way of transitioning, is a way of sort of like allowing the alchemy of your experience to manifest within your changes.
Yeah.
And I find that just all of my conflicts have also been from stagnancy. Stop motion, I think I stopped doing precisely because I felt like I wasn't moving myself, and so I wanted to move physically, but now I feel like I might actually return to stop motion. So
But yeah, I feel like there's a lot of people that explore these avenues, but like it feels like you have also the introspection to process it and understand it, you know, like have these reflections, which is very inspiring to me, like to see.
yeah,
Like,
introspection I think is such a vast world. I think we'll never fully comprehend it, and I think it's kind of great that it's this infinite field, because I think that just like the way that we perceive life is obviously unique to each of our world models, and I think that within the art I create, it's speculative, but it's also fantastical in the sense of like exploring kind of the introspective states of what makes someone's perception there. But also I think it's interesting because I say all of this, but I think also above all, like there's a very intuitive and very sort of like incidental kind of thing that comes out of the things that I create. And I feel like, you know, I used to really like to plan my ideas, but I think now I'm more interested in the materials. For instance, this I made today, I was just sort of attracted, I think, firstly to like the idea of sort of like an eye that has a mind, and manifesting that through literally having a face that comes out of an eye, and in the sense of like an eye that kind of represents both ages. But as I was starting to make it, I was more attracted by the shape, and sometimes meaning comes like that. It comes through shapes, and then you find the word for it, and then sometimes that happens. So sometimes I think just trusting your process, and sometimes just trusting that you have an instinct, and that instinct knows something, but you will only find it if you search for it, if you go for it.
and I organize retreats, and that's one of the workshops I do. It's not in the form of sculpture, but it's in the form of like doing something random with an intention in mind, which is just to receive something. And then something comes up, it reminds you of something, or you feel something, or you smell something, and then you move from there, and you just go into this invisible tangent that brings you exactly, for me it's like a tarot reading. It gives you this abstract
This is
information.
exactly why I love surrealism. I think surrealism at its core manifests this important kind of valuable creativity in tangents and in what's invisible and paradoxical. And I think that so much of like my process has been inspired by just surrealism, because it is this sort of it's sort of like this form of being able to let your boundless, what's in front of you, what's spontaneously in front of you, let that kind of manifest in journaling through it, you know, at its course, and letting things kind of live through just chance and spontaneities.
Yeah, there's a beauty to that, and I think this is coming out through the people I encounter, because I do feel like we have been, society has been putting humans in a box for so long that the feminine kind of flowy qualities of humanity have been repressed. And now I think there is a true desire of everyone of the collective soul to start rebalancing that by exploring those fluid places.
It's interesting because I think with the box, there comes the initial intention of wanting to be able to understand something. And so the archetype is created so that the kind of agenda or the person can kind of essentially exist within a sphere that people can read. But I think what makes it problematic is that each person is individual and each group is individual. So things will constantly flux and things will constantly change. And so, it limits people because the archetype has a limit. Some people feel comfortable with that, but I think that I personally like things that are constantly sprawling because, life is like that and people are like that. People are paradoxical and I think that's beautiful. And I think that one of the things I hope with my work at least, or, is that it can remind people of just that spontaneity of sort of like, living is a process and creating is a process and existing is a continual process, and you yourself are also a process that must be lived the whole way through.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think that's a very important message. And I think you're the right person to ask this. Like, being an artist yourself, being in the art world, do you feel there is a shift in the art world, like of the way we express and the reason mainly, like why we would want to express something on a scene or wherever?
Oh, absolutely. I think just obviously a lot can be talked about with AI and a lot can be talked about with algorithms. I think that what's happened in my perspective is that I think that people have become very aware of sort of like, the responsibility of creating and also the responsibility of art sharing. Through AI, there's obviously been just a lot of replication and a lot of people have been afraid of it in the same way as the internet. I mean, people have had countless conversations about this, but I think what I find interesting about existing in the art world is that I feel like I feel like it's at a point, I don't think anyone can imitate each other. I feel like there's been 1,000 people imitating each other to the point where the replication or the creation comes very much within every individual's input. I must also say that just as someone who is also currently 23 and also graduating and has been in London for about 4 years and is discovering themselves, there's also a lot that's mysterious to me. There's also a lot that just also as someone who's not represented by any gallery, I also feel a lot of looseness and also a lot of sort of like sense of like my sense of creating is very personal. It's very independent, but it's also very much like made in collectives. It's made with people, places, times, and agendas. And I personally don't view AI bad, but I think that the thing that I concern about with art making is people just losing the responsibility. And I think it was Terry Gilliam who spoke about this. I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was this really unique comment where he talked about it's no longer a fact of how advanced technology gets. It's more of a fact now of how responsible we are for our technology. And I think that it's an ageless sort of value, I think, because it speaks more about just how we exist with technology and how we kind of also accept and respond to it.
From my observation too, it will bring in like a mirror up to society. Like more and more we kind of delegate our intelligence to external things like Alexa and all those devices that have AI integrated in it. And at some point there comes a tipping point. You're like, okay, well, if everything thinks for me, then who am I? Then my thinking brain, my rational brain.
And this exactly is what turned me into a more, like, I wanted to work with more practical arts. Like I used to do CG, I used to work with Maya and I stopped using it because I didn't like that I didn't have connection, to my body. It's like the value of creating something is a process that's inscribed within your memory, your pain of making it, all the procrastination.
But I think even more than connecting with your body, I think perhaps that's what you're referring to, is like connecting to the energy that animates the body, like this energy which is connected to your spirit, this primitive energy, this intuition that is stored in the body, more than the actual flesh, like folding and stuff. Yes, there's that, but the sensation of it is just an electric signal that goes to your brain. In actuality, it's the pure prana moving through you. And I think for me, that's what I'm observing, is that it brings people back to the source. Okay, well, if everything can be replicated in the external world, who am I? And then you have to connect to your soul. This soul cannot be replicated. That's the only thing you have that cannot be replicated.
Exactly. No, I think that's really beautifully put. And I think that also just with creating as well, and I think just also with a lot of surrealism, what I really like is that in the miraging of time, the kind of obscurity of what identifies a place and a person, it's kind of asking itself to be seen within a primordial way, in that you are kind of looking at it in a sense that relates to just your pure senses, your pure intuition, your pure immediate kind of like acceptance or rejection. And I think that just being reminded of that, I think is really sort of crucial. But I think just as a culture, as a society, I think that we're gonna, obviously, I think just with technology, I think everyone will be a lot more conscious of visual mediums, like trusting visual mediums, being also aware of what defines and also what is artificial, but also I think in what alienates, I think it also brings people together in a collective sense of not knowing. The processing of just any war, I think, or any kind of history books comes from a place, I think, of firstly sort of being in that state of disarray. And I think will just, it's always going to be like that.
Yeah, that's very well said. Maybe to end, I like to end this way. Is there something these days that's on your heart, like something you're going through, or something that feels like you're extracting some wisdom from, that you think could be valuable to share to everyone that's going to be watching?
Yeah, I think I'll have to think about that. That's a really probing question. Definitely one I want to think carefully about, just in how, or maybe not so carefully about, and just let whatever comes out. I mean, I would say again, like, just the whole thing of, like, I think a lot of people become very self-critical. They become very self-doubtful of what they create. And they always have a lot of these very big agendas. I think one of the most valuable lessons I learned was to sometimes, because I used to be just very analytical of what I do, and that's not a bad thing at all. Like, I think it's really important to have intellect and to analyze, but I think a lot of people who I've seen create who really struggle is sometimes this sort of refusal to make because they feel like they can't make. And I think sometimes people have really got to allow themselves that ability to fail, and that ability to kind of, or not even fail, but just to even be able to express. And to express, you need to be able to move your hand,
or to accept any outcome.
You need to use your voice. You need to use your hands. And I think, that's the thing. That's the core thing that's going to get that thing made, or that's going to get that decision done, is by doing. And I think that just generally my advice for anyone would be sort of like really sort of allow the kind of elements that brings any idea into tuition or into form, allow that thing to work. And it, even if it's sort of something that's not the most smartest, or it's not the most brilliant, or it's not going to push you forward and it's going to repeat, it's still a form of process, and it's very valuable. But yeah, I think for me, like, that would be the most crucial thing to think. And also just to kind of sometimes, yeah, it is important to challenge yourself and to really sort of like sometimes go in a completely different direction, sometimes just for the sake of it, to know how you would do this if you were put in a state of disarray. I feel like sometimes I work best in last minute situations because I have no choice but to just do it.
Yeah.
And so I think, but obviously the hope is that you'd be doing that, before what you're doing, before your deadline, before your time is coming. But I think that, I would say to everyone, like, I think really give yourself time to grow things, and also really trust your intuition. Your intelligence is crucial, but your intuition is, I think, what immediately senses things and moves things.
Yeah, I like to see intuition, like your conscious mind has all the information in front, but there's too much information that it has to pick, like, and take a decision with like the limited amount of things that the consciousness can absorb, while the intuition is connected to all the ocean of the unconsciousness and can in one instant just track all the things and take the right decision. So it's always the
compromise as well. I think also unconscious creation, I really find inspiring. I try to embrace as much as possible, because especially with performance, like sometimes I'll get all of my ideas for a performance and sometimes the whole theme. Sometimes like the day, actually Ken, who was on this podcast, we were doing a performance for a color factory, and we had under a day. My friend had suffered a real bad loss, and we basically within a single day, with just confidence, with just being in a space together, being with materials, being surrounded just by our materials, we shocked ourselves with how much we immediately just created a whole choreography with just materials. And I think just that's why it's important to be there and present, to be present, to be physically with the things, because that causes a reaction, that causes an interaction, and you will then intuitively create that through doing. And so I should also elaborate on compromise, because I think that I used to have this perfectionist sort of like agenda of like I needed to make the most sort of like ideal version of this idea. But I think that also in what doesn't work, you obviously are still at it at trying to get it to work, and by doing that you then discover something entirely new. And I think it's about you try as much as you can, the kind of keyword is try, to kind of get to the idea that you want to, but it is kind of a bluff, this sort of like idealized sort of thing. You are going about it just with whatever's available to you, resource wise and creation wise or idea wise. And I think just sometimes trusting that is crucial, because that's what's around you.
Yeah. And often, even if it's micro mistakes, there's a lot of wisdom. And
there could be like a whole universe within.
Yeah, you can learn so much about yourself from how you react to these things. Like there's value everywhere, basically. Also,
absolutely.
So yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I think your mind is very fascinating, and I'm excited like for what's to come. I know, like, I don't know. I tapped into your universe when I saw your show. I tapped into your chart, and now we have a conversation, so I get to know you better as well. And I just feel for you that there is a lot of boundary pushing that's going to happen in your career, and it will have. I do sense you will have an impact in the way you push boundaries in the arts and in whatever you do. So I'm excited to have you back on the podcast in a year or in a few years to see like what this will have manifested into.
Thank you so much, Alex. No, I think this has been a really, really, really valuable evening that I can't really put into words, but I just think just to even just be able to confront confusement like this is sometimes just valuable, to even string ideas, or just I find that just is how things are kind of how they grow.
Yeah.
And I think that just I really like that you're also just very open to that. I think that is sort of just is that I
yeah that's what I think. That's what I do. I also do like one-on-one sessions, and what we just did is like what my heart is beating to do in this world is help people see the bigger picture by also getting like all the beads on the necklace, like how they were connected, and then it gives you more momentum, like to see the bigger picture and to get the ball rolling. So I'm glad that you had this reflection. It means a lot. So
Thank you so much.
So that concludes this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please like and subscribe. It means a lot and encourages me to continue on this spiritual journey and movement I'm creating with Rose Umbra.